Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving deep into the absolute core of mass influence. We're going to break down exactly how populations organize to flip the script on power, and on the flip side, how entities manipulate those very populations to hold on to it. It's a fascinating look at the hidden architecture of both control and resistance.
But before we get into the hard data, we really need to ask ourselves a fundamental question about the true nature of power. Who actually has the upper hand? Think about your own assumptions for a second. Do you believe sheer numbers and the public always win out? Or does institutional control always hold the ultimate advantage?
To figure this out, here's our roadmap for today. First, we'll look at the tipping point of protest. Second, the anatomy of propaganda. Third, the glittering generality. Fourth, the fire hose of falsehood. And finally, defending your cognition.
All right, kicking things off with Section 1, the tipping point of protest. We're looking at bottom-up power and civil resistance.
There is one massive number you need to remember here, and it's 3.5%. According to political scientist Erica Chenoweth, who analyzed the NAVCO dataset, which is this huge tracking of campaigns from 1900 to 2006, if just 3.5% of a population actively joins a nonviolent protest, regime change becomes practically inevitable. Think about that. You don't need a majority. You literally just need a highly mobilized fraction.
And here is where conventional wisdom gets totally flipped on its head. Historically speaking, nonviolent campaigns are actually more than twice as successful as violent revolts. We're talking a 26% success rate for violent campaigns, while nonviolent ones hit 53%. Why? Well, nonviolent movements pull in about 4 times as many people. The barriers to entry are just way lower. No weapons needed, no extreme physical demands, which makes mass participation so much easier for the average person.
This isn't just theory either. It is a historically validated reality. Look at the singing revolution, the Velvet, Cedar, and Rose revolutions. We're seeing this play out globally, across totally different political landscapes. In every single one of these cases, nonviolent mass mobilization successfully challenged heavily entrenched power structures.
Because of this exact data, modern movements actively target that 3.5% sweet spot. Climate activists explicitly use this rule as their benchmark. We even saw this in the recent American demonstrations. For example, crowdsourced data from the June 2025 No Kings protests estimated around 4 to 6 million people showed up. That's roughly 1.2 to 1.8% of the U.S. population. Fast forward to October, and those protests swelled to nearly 7 million participants, hitting about 2%. They are organizing millions, though as the math shows, they're still pushing to cross that ultimate 3.5% tipping point.
So this brings us to a huge pivot. If a relatively tiny fraction of the public holds that much potential power, how on earth do regimes actually maintain control? How do leaders keep populations fragmented enough to stop that 3.5% from forming in the first place?
That brings us to Section 2, the anatomy of propaganda, focusing on top-down control and cognitive hacking. We're getting into the dark side of influence here.
Here's the scary part. Propagandists don't really care about your logic. Instead, they completely exploit our innate human vulnerabilities. They weaponize confirmation bias, leaning hard into what we already believe. They rely on emotional arousal, pushing fear and disgust, because let's face it, emotionally charged stories travel way faster than facts. They use affective primacy, where our quick gut reactions totally override our slow, logical deliberation. And finally, the familiarity loop. We tend to trust a message simply because we've heard it a dozen times, completely regardless of whether it's actually true.
Let's zoom in a bit for Section 3, the glittering generality. These are the rhetorical micro-tactics used to manipulate us.
Way back in the 1930s, the Institute for Propaganda Analysis coined this term. A glittering generality is essentially a technique that uses vague, emotionally charged buzzwords, often called virtue words. By linking a proposal to an absolutely unassailable virtue, the speaker manufactures consensus through pure emotion instead of logical debate. Basically, they want your applause, but they definitely don't want to give you any concrete details to actually scrutinize.
Just think about words like freedom, justice, democracy, patriotism, progress. Notice how you instinctively react to them? They sound amazing, right? But their inherent vagueness is the whole trick. It allows listeners to project their own personal definitions onto them. So if a politician says they're fighting for justice, everybody cheers, because everybody assumes their definition of justice perfectly matches the speaker's. It completely masks any actual policy flaws.
And we can track this tactic everywhere, across history and across the entire political spectrum.
It was a staple of 1930s totalitarian regimes, and it's absolutely everywhere today. We see it in right-wing slogans like Make America Great Again, and we see it in left-wing or environmental buzzwords like sustainability. In all these cases, they're swapping out actual causal reasoning for an emotional shortcut.
Now let's zoom out to the systemic macro tactics in Section 4, the fire hose of falsehood.
Pioneered by Russian state actors, this strategy is a completely different beast from traditional persuasion. The goal here isn't to sell you on one single, perfectly crafted lie. Not at all. The goal is to entertain, confuse, and completely overwhelm your ability to figure out what's true. It relies on a massive, relentless volume of repetitive messaging across multiple channels, shamelessly blending partial truths right alongside total fictions. And the craziest part is how incredibly targeted this is. A Rand Corporation report laid out how this works as a highly specific, data-driven offensive strategy. First, propagandists slice the population into distinct communities based on hobbies, politics, or specific needs. Second, they figure out exactly who is most susceptible to certain types of messages. And third, they map out the social dynamics to flood those exact, specific communities with perfectly tailored disinformation. On top of that, they use visual trickery. By mimicking legitimate news broadcasts through proxy channels and using huge social media amplification, these falsehoods look incredibly credible. They're capitalizing on what psychologists call peripheral cues. Things like a scrolling news ticker or a professional-looking anchor desk. Through sheer repetition and this illusion of objectivity, the fictions lodge themselves in the public consciousness. And thanks to those psychological loopholes we talked about earlier, once those initial lies take root, trying to dig them out with factual corrections later is unbelievably difficult.
So, how do we fight back? That brings us to our final stop. Section 5, Defending Your Cognition and Building Media Literacy.
To neutralize these glittering generalities and outmaneuver that fire hose of falsehood, we have to actively build up our cognitive defenses. First up, demand definitional clarity. When you hear one of those virtue words, immediately ask, okay, but how exactly? And by what means? Cross-reference vague claims with actual data. Evaluate a source's incentives. Are they a real news organization or just mimicking one? And on a broader scale, researchers say we shouldn't just exhaust ourselves playing whack-a-mole with lies. Instead, we need to direct steady, factual information streams at targeted audiences to guide them in productive directions.
Author Terry Kennefield has a brilliant way of describing these media literacy strategies. She calls them essential raincoats, because in today's media environment where you're constantly standing in this deluge of propaganda and a literal fire hose of falsehoods, you simply can't stop the rain, but you absolutely can put on a raincoat to protect yourself and help strengthen our democratic processes.
As we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with one final, slightly provocative thought. When you look at the media you consume every day, take a step back and ask yourself, are the beliefs you hold right now truly your own, or were they engineered by the hidden mechanics of mass influence? True power isn't just about taking to the streets, it requires the daily vigilance to protect your own mind. Thanks for joining me on this deep dive. Stay curious, stay sharp, and I'll see you in the next one.